Chapter 7, Key Issue 2, Content Objective. Students will describe the forced and voluntary ethnic migration on a global, national, and local scales. I can statements. 1. Describe the patterns of forced voluntary migration of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans to the United States. 2. Describe the patterns of migration of African Americans within the United States for the 20th century and the 21st century. 3. Explain the laws once used to segregate races in the United States and South Africa. Lastly, discuss the interregional and intra-regional diffusion patterns of African Americans and white ethnic groups. There's a video of the slave triangle. Most African Americans are descendants from Western Hemisphere, and they brought to the United States as slaves, so forced migration, international migration. When we look at Asian Americans and Hispanics Americans, they were mostly through international voluntary migration. However, it's important to keep in mind that when we look at Vietnamese in the 1970s, it was forced persecution, and then also in that last half of the 20th century, Cubans were forced out as well because of persecution, seen as refugees from each of those locations. There was also forced migration after World War II with Poles and Germans and Russians. The losing side to World War II were forced to migrate. European countries acquired slaves from various regions of Africa. Most Africans were taken from the interior and brought to coastal cities. And it was first started by the Spanish and Portuguese. The Portuguese shipped slaves from Angola and Mozambique to Brazil. Estimates were over 2 million slaves were brought to Brazil. And European countries, first, as I mentioned, was the Spanish. Then, about 100 years after the Spanish started slaving or exchanging slaves in the 1500s, the 16th century. Then a century later, the Dutch and the British began to slave or trade slaves, and they again would take them from the interior and brought to coastal cities in Liberia or Congo, and then send them to the Caribbean islands in South America, and later to colonial America. Here we look at the slave triangle. Just remember that in the height of slavery was really between 1710 and 1810, where over 10 million Africans were forced to internationally migrate. Of that, when they came across, they arrived, the horrible forced migration was unimaginable hardship, with separating families, destroying villages, taking the strongest and the youngest as slaves, stripping African countries of that future labor, and then also there was minimal food, harsh conditions, unsanitary conditions, and 1/4 are estimated to have died in this transport across the Atlantic Ocean. The triangular trade consisted of movement of ships sailed from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, from the Americas to Europe, and from Europe to Africa. From Africa, slaves and gold were transported to the Western Hemisphere, primarily in the Caribbean islands. We look at the movement of slaves within this forced migration. We can see, again, the European countries that brought the slaves across. One thing to also note that when we talk about slavery, European countries were primarily responsible for forcing the migration of slaves and diffusing it to the Western Hemisphere. However, very little slave representation diffused to European countries. Here's the look at the slave triangle. Again, ships left Europe, and when they left Europe for Africa, they brought clothes and other goods to buy in exchange for slaves. Then they shipped the slaves across the Atlantic, and the ships would then go to and receive in the Caribbean. They would get sugar and molasses and other tropical crops, and then they would carry those to North America, and then they would make rum in North America, and then also when the slavery picks up in the height between the 1700s and 1800s, they begin to manufacture cotton, and cotton will be an important cash crop that will go across to Europe. This movement of slavery happened to at high levels up until 1808 when slavery was banned, but slaves still continued to come across even though it was banned in 1808. We look at voluntary migration patterns, and we see Mexico and Puerto Ricans, the two nationalities that are found under the Hispanic ethnicity, migrating as the largest groups. And then the third largest would be forced migration from Cuba as refugees because of political persecution. We look at Asian migrants. We can see the largest is migrants that come across within the Asian ethnicity or the nationality of Chinese, followed by Indian and Philippines. And we can see again this miscategorization of Asian ethnicity. Many of them see themselves as nationalities, not as Asian American. All right, looking at the voluntary migration in a pie chart, we see that most Hispanics, as well as recent Asian American immigrants, are migrating with children or grandchildren. Looking at Asian and Hispanic ethnic distribution patterns and migratory patterns, we can see that the Immigration Act of 1965, remember back from our migration unit, it abolished quota laws and it was based on national quotas. So that increased the movement or the allowing entrance of Asian and Hispanic ethnicities. Most Asian are going to come because of preferred status. Remember, that's an exemption to the quota laws currently, so they have skills in professional services. And we see with Hispanic and Asian ethnicities, they've commonly used chain migration. Remember, chain migration from the migration unit is when you follow family members in succession, and usually using step migratory patterns. And then we see the refugee resettlement pattern, which was created at the close of the Vietnam War, which allowed the refugees to migrate through the Southeast Asian refugee program. All right, quickly review what we've just talked about. Moving on to African American distribution and diffusion patterns, we see there's three distinct internal migratory patterns in the U.S. First, most African Americans will identify through forced slavery. However, in the 20th century, so the 1900s, we see interregional migration from the south to northern cities. This is going to be known as the Great Migration. And really, the cause to this is going to be advancement of agricultural production, no longer needing sharecroppers. It's going to force African Americans to migrate to industrial centers, major cities in the north that are growing secondary sector jobs. Then in the mid 1900s, so the mid 20th century, we see intra-regional migration. That's when we see white flight, when white ethnic groups move to suburbs, and we see the expansion of inner-city ghettos to the outer lying areas of the central city. Then the third migratory pattern, the current pattern in the 21st century, so in the 2000s, we see interregional migration, but the migration is from the northern urban centers back to southeast rural and urban areas. African Americans display those two distinct patterns in the 20th century. And also when we talk about that interregional migration, it's largely affected by white flight that's caused by blockbusting and redlining. Blockbusting is when when realtors scare white ethnicities of the devaluing of their property, then they're scared out of their neighborhoods to migrate to suburban areas. And redlining is created by real estate agents that literally take out a map of an area and they draw a red line and they tell areas of the city that will not receive mortgage loans to buy houses. Redlining and blockbusting are commonly associated with systemic racism. All right, let's go back to the interregional migration, the cause, the end of sharecropping. Now fields are rented from a landowner and they couldn't pay the rent for their land, so they were forced to migrate. The mechanization in the agriculture, or the primary sectors in the South, expanded to what are commercial farms, while the manufacturing jobs grew in the North, which is a pull factor to northern cities, such as Detroit or Cleveland or Toledo or Milwaukee. Those would be industrial centers in the North. And they often traveled along by bus along major two-lane highways, because we have now the Interstate Highway Act that had been passed in the 1950s. All right, here's a flow chart that shows the migratory patterns. As the aforementioned, they go to industrial centers like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. We can see how this migratory pattern of this ethnic group influences the cultural landscape. All right, again, take this moment to reflect on what you've learned. As I mentioned before, take this opportunity to write down the answers and be comprehensive. Use it as FRQ practice. Interregional migration, this is in the 1950s. So within these northern cities, the expanding of the ghettos, because you have white flight. What was some of one of the causes, some of the texts will say, and the new text says it as well, is going to be the Brown versus Board of Education Act passed, so desegregating schools, forced white ethnicities to intra-regionally migrate to suburbs. We can see this with Detroit. We can see with other major cities. We see the white population decline by nearly 1.5 million between 1950 and 2000. Intra-regional migration clusters African Americans into one or two neighborhoods, commonly known as ghettos. They, again, follow the Blockbuster Board versus Brown ruling, white flight, and then blockbusting and redlining. Here shows a line chart that shows the decrease of white ethnicities within urban centers or central cities. Here's a look at Baltimore, and when we look at Baltimore, we can see the distribution and the decline of the increase of African American and also the decline of white ethnicity. Here's a look at Detroit. All right, let's talk about how segregation and how ethnic groups and racial groups are segregated. First, let's look at the United States. With Plessy versus Ferguson, it stated that the constitutional law was separate but equal. So separate facilities, institutions, transportation institutions, social institutions, educational institutions were all separated, but they're equal. But in retrospect, equality was not achieved. When we see these laws that are in place, it reinforces Jim Crow laws and also black codes. Jim Crow laws were found primarily in the South, where there was this separated black and white institutions. For instance, blacks had designated areas on buses, designated areas for restaurants, hotels, jobs, and then whites had designated institutions. Here's a picture of what it would look like. All right, moving on to South Africa, they had laws that are very similar to segregation, but they were much more harsh because they physically separated different races. They quantified race or categorized races, and then they segregated by areas by drawing demarcation lines. They would classify races into 4 categories: black, white, then you had colored and Asian, and everyone had a different legal status, and with that legal status they were bound to certain neighborhoods. Apartheid laws ended in the early 1990s with Nelson Mandela and Frederick de Klerk repealing the law in 1991, eliminated apartheid laws. Here's a look at apartheid laws in South Africa. Again, here shows you the racial neighborhoods found within South Africa during the apartheid. All right, let's move on to India. India and Pakistan, so South Asia. The partition plan of 1947 divided 2 countries. You had East Pakistan and West Pakistan as predominantly Muslim, and then you had India, predominantly Hindu. During this international migratory trend, we've learned that the traveling of this stretch, there are many casualties. Estimates say that 17 were forced to migrate, and during that migration process, many had perished along the way. And and again, these refugees experienced attacks based on their ethnic and religious backgrounds. And there was a line of control that was maintained and administered in the northern portion, which is now the disputed region of Kashmir. And Kashmir's up here. So we see with Kashmir, still today, India blames Pakistan for the unrest and vows to retain this portion of Kashmir, whereas Pakistan argues that Kashmir on both sides of the border should choose their own future in a vote. So India claims Kashmir, and Pakistan wants to leave it up to the people to vote. And when we look at the demographic distribution in Kashmir, we see that there's a smaller population of Indians and a much larger population of Pakistan, or Pakistani. Looking at the Kurds, here is a nation without a state. So they, again, do not have sovereignty, or they have a homeland without governing rights. They're divided. The Kurds are divided amongst many countries, as we see here: Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Armenia, where they are represented as the minority ethnic group in all these countries. All right, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned.